Welcome all to the first Sakharov lecture organized by the European representation in Malta. Over the next hour and a half, we'll be having a few addresses by our main guest, who I am honored to introduce today, is Ahmed El Senussi, Sakharov Prize Laureate for 2011. He is one of Libya's most recognized political prisoners under the Gaddafi regime. He spent 31 years incarcerated. He was a member of the National Transitional Council, which was the political face of the revolution which overthrew Gaddafi. And he is the leader of the Cyrenaica Transitional Council, which is the federalist, a political body advocating for a federalist future for Libya, in which the regions of Libya are given greater autonomy. For the proceedings, we'll be speaking in English or Arabic. You have translation facilities. There are two channels on these devices, which there are two channels, I'm told, 1 and 2. One is English and 2 is Arabic. I will invite you to address the conference either in English or in Arabic. We will start with a brief introduction by Therese Komodini-Kakia, who's an MP and an established human rights lawyer, so it's quite fitting that she should start today. Please.
2 days ago, the United Nations and the world community commemorated Human Rights Day under the slogan Human Rights 365. The slogan that conveys the idea that each one of us, everywhere, at all times, is entitled to the full range of human rights, that human rights belong equally to each of us and bind us together as a global community with the same ideals and values. Though it is a fact that numerically more people in the world enjoy the full range of human rights to which they are entitled to today than any other time in history, it is equally a stark reality that still today, the full enjoyment of human rights is denied to tens of millions of people. In his message for this year's Human Rights Day, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, denounced those authorities who deny the rights of any person or group, while emphasizing that the enjoyment of human rights is a matter of individual justice, social stability, and global progress. The United Nations protects human rights because that is our proud mission, and because when people enjoy their rights, economies flourish and countries are at peace, he stated. 66 years ago, on 10th December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the UN General Assembly. This was a result of the cruel experience of the Second World War. In so doing, the international community set the human rights identified in the Universal Declaration as a common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. It is worth recalling the opening paragraphs of the preamble to the Universal Declaration, not only to understand the historical context in which the Declaration was adopted, but also to appreciate how the notions expressed therein remain valid and pertinent to this very day, namely, that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. That disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. That the advent of a world in which human beings shall enjoy freedom of speech and belief and freedom from fear and want has been proclaimed as the highest aspiration of the common people. And finally, that it is essential if man is not to be compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression. Basically, that human rights should be protected by the rule of law. In 5 days' time, we shall be commemorating a tragic event that took place 4 years ago, when, on the 17th December 2010, in the rural town of Sidi Bouzid in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, a young 26-year-old vegetable street vendor, set himself on fire in protest against a system that kept him from making a decent living for himself and his family. Within hours, Bouaziz's self-immolation sparked widespread protests by Tunisians fighting for true democracy and greater freedom. Protests that finally led to the downfall of the Ben Ali regime. The protests, however, also united many of the populations of the Arab world, including Egypt and later Libya. In all these instances, these populations had been compelled to have recourse as a last resort to rebellion against tyranny and oppression, perhaps. In Libya, our neighboring state, the Gaddafi regime reacted with ruthless violence to the non-violent demonstrators, calling for a constitution that ensured democracy, good governance, and the rule of law. A level of violence against unarmed populations that forced the international community to intervene to protect civilians and civilian-populated areas under threat of attack. Time does not permit me to detail the agony that the Libyan people had to suffer in the struggle to bring to an end an authoritarian regime that had dominated their lives for more than 4 decades. Yet, the dawning of a new era that would see the Libyan people's yearning to live in freedom in a stable, democratic society that was so pronounced in the months following liberation was soon to be overshadowed by an escalation of fighting among local groups, including attacks on civilians and civilian property involving massive human rights violations. The current situation of renewed violence threatens to bring to naught the sacrifice of so many thousands who lost their lives or participated in the struggle for liberation. It is the firm hope of the vast majority of the Libyan people and of the international community that through firm political will and a commitment to democracy, all social and political forces in Libya find the necessary resolve to unite in seeking the path towards peace and reconciliation. This was the sentiment expressed by the European Parliament in its resolution on the situation in Libya adopted earlier this year in September. The European Parliament called on all parties to the conflict to immediately cease all violence and agree to a ceasefire in order to end the escalating suffering of the population and to engage in an inclusive national political dialogue to build a state based on respect for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The European Parliament also reiterated the EU's unwavering support for and commitment to the democratic aspirations of the Libyan people, in particular during the current crisis and in the democratic transition of the country, and also called for strengthened EU involvement in support of stability and democratic transition in Libya. As a member of that parliament, I continue to believe that this is the only path to be followed if we truly cherish the welfare of the Libyan people and their right to live in a democratic society where the rule of law prevails. I state this since occasionally some are tempted to believe that all in all, Libya was better off or maybe more stable under Gaddafi than it is at present in view of the current tensions and conflicts. Yet, those making similar statements ignore the fact that under that apparent veneer of stability, there was a ruthless, repressive state, an apparatus at work that for years on end not only denied the people of Libya of the most fundamental human rights, but even destroyed the lives of thousands of other Libyans who were killed, imprisoned, or exiled. The June 1996 massacre at Tripoli's Abu Salim prison, with an estimated 1,270 prisoners killed, is just one of many examples of the utter brutality of the Gaddafi regime. Another example of the Gaddafi regime's ferocity is the 31-year imprisonment suffered by our guest speaker today, Ahmed El Senussi. He is a great-nephew of King Idris of Libya. Ahmed El Senussi, however, was arrested in 1970 and sentenced to death for plotting to overthrow the then one-year-old Gaddafi regime. In 1998, after 28 years in prison, 9 of them in solitary confinement, his death sentence was commuted and he was finally released from prison in 2001. To help you better understand the meaning of 31 years imprisonment, I would like to mention that Ahmed El Senussi was imprisoned 3 years before I was born. And he was released from imprisonment 4 years after I was graduated as a lawyer and had already started practicing as a lawyer. Ahmed El Senussi was awarded the 2011 Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought for his courageous work to improve human rights and the rule of law in Libya. He considers the Sakharov Prize he received to be an award to the Libyan people. In his acceptance speech, Ahmed El Senussi said that the Sakharov Prize has huge symbolic and moral value. It also provides further stimulus for the consolidation of the values we have always been in favor of, the creation of a democratic constitutional state based upon the equality of all. In an interview soon after receiving the Sakharov Prize, Ahmed El Senussi said that the Libyan people will do everything that they can to keep this new liberty and freedom. Last September, in my contribution to the debate on the European Parliament resolution on the situation in Libya, I stated that the European Union has an important role to play in assisting the Libyan people to follow a process of democratization. It is of great concern to know that human rights are being violated in a gross manner, and it would be crass not to act. I continue to believe that the European Union can still play an active role in helping and assisting the Libyan people and the Libyan social and political forces towards the path of reconciliation. Named after Andrei Sakharov, the father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, it is worth recalling that Sakharov was awarded the Peace Prize in 1975 for his opposition to the abuse of power and his work for human rights. The leaders of the Soviet Union had refused Sakharov, who at the time was under house arrest and under strict surveillance, permission to travel to Oslo to receive the prize, and it had to be his wife, Jelena Bonner, who received it on his behalf. In his Nobel lecture read by his wife, Sakharov had emphasized his conviction that peace, progress, and human rights are 3 goals that are insolubly linked to each other. It is impossible, he said, to achieve one of these goals if the other 2 are ignored. In that same speech, Sakharov stated that since the protection of human rights has been proclaimed in the Universal Declaration, this cannot, for this reason, be said to be a matter of purely internal or domestic concern. In order to achieve this great goal, no exertions are too great, however long the road may seem. I am convinced that this same belief continues to be shared by the vast majority of the Libyan people. Thank you.
I'd like to invite Peter Juice, who is the head of the European representation in Malta.
Dear Mr. El Senussi, Excellencies, members of the European Parliament, honorable members of Parliament, distinguished guests, colleagues, welcome. On your entrance, you were greeted with an exhibition of photographs which the European Parliament office set up in 2011 in the breeze of the Arab Spring. That exhibition is meant to give a context to the Sakharov lecture today. It is not where we are, it is where we are coming from. Today with us, we have a man who has lived these moments and all the harshness of that regime that fell in that Arab Spring on his own skin. We invited this man to Valletta to tell us firsthand, where do we go from here? And hence the theme of the Sakharov lecture, what Arab Spring for human rights? The Sakharov Prize, as you will know, is named for Andrei Sakharov, a Soviet nuclear physicist, who, concerned with the moral and political implications of his work, came to become a human rights activist. The Sakharov Prize rewards people and organizations who put their lives at stake for the sake of freedom of expression, the rights of minorities, respect for international law, development of democracy, and the rule of law. Sakharov laureates include Nelson Mandela, Aung San Suu Kyi, Malala, Denis Mukwege, and Ahmed Bouazizi, mentioned by the MEP, who ignited the Arab Spring by burning his own life in protest of oppression. The 7 November Square in Tunisia is now the Mohamed Bouazizi Square. In certain countries, indeed, the heroes of our time are recognized, and societies are built around their contribution. In others, human rights activists have to face an uphill struggle. It is for this reason that the Sakharov Prize Network was established, with a view to enhancing the impact of the work of Sakharov laureates through a continuing relationship with the Union, its politicians, and its citizens. For this reason, it is our honor in Valletta to be one of the very first offices to give a concrete face to the Sakharov network by inviting Mr. El Senussi to deliver the Sakharov lecture. Over the past few days, I came to know Mr. El Senussi more closely, and I have been touched by 2 main things, at least. One is that having spent 31 years in prison, entering in the 70s and coming out in 2001, he is as technology savvy as most of our students here, with Skype, Facebook, and the rest. The second is that after suffering all the harshness and injustice of a totalitarian regime, you can dig in his heart and find out that you will not find a shred of hatred. You will find only hope in the future, hope in the people. Mr. El Senussi, we look forward to your Sakharov lecture. Thank you.
With that, I invite Mr. El Senussi to address the...
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. I wish this lecture to be as fruitful and successful as I wish it to be, and to answer all your questions as well. I came here carrying the sufferings of my people on my shoulders. A nation which suffered greatly under the dictator Gaddafi's regime. 42 years of oppression, of wiping out the Libyan identity, 42 years of corruption and humiliation. These years, which I and many others like me lived most of them in prison, but as logic as it sounds, the destiny of a dictator is always fatal.
وأطال في عمره حتى يرى نهاية الطاغية. نهاية الطغاة لابد أن تكون مؤلمة لأنهم لم يقدموا الخير لأبنائهم.
He left Libya with nothing. The only institution which was strong was his own security body and his own militias. The militias, which he thought to be the strong shield for him against any attempt to change his regime.
وكتائب خاصة. أما الجيش وبقية المؤسسات الأمنية فكانت مستبعدة ولا قيمة لها، ويظن أن هذه الكتائب ستكون له الدرع الحصين تجاه أي محاولة لتغيير نظامه. ولكن إرادة
But
الشعوب هي
the
أقوى
will of a
من
nation
إرادة كل
is
قضية.
always stronger than the will of a dictator.
كانت الثورة الليبية
In the beginning, people went
في
out
بدايتها
asking for a change of
مطالبة
their living conditions, not for a change of a regime.
بالعدالة،
But when he faced their
مطالبة
demands with killing,
بالإصلاح،
the roof of the demands went
فوجه
off and he had to go.
بالقتل بمختلف أنواع الأسلحة.
And so it went.
شباب عبروا
We paid a high price,
رغبتهم
supported by the international community,
فوجهوا
the European Commission,
بهذا العنف
and the United States of America to
فانطلب
obtain our freedom.
المطلب من الإصلاح إلى إسقاط النظام.
And so a dictator went down.
نعم،
Unfortunately,
نحن
Gaddafi
دفعنا ثمنا غاليا،
left no institutions in
ولكن
Libya,
كان
and that's why
بمؤازرة
chaos became the name of
من
the game.
جيراننا الأوروبيين ومن المجتمع الدولي والولايات المتحدة وكل الأحرار الذين أرادوا أن نتمتع بحريتنا كما تمتع بها الآخرون. وكانت النهاية نهاية أليمة لطاغية استبدت 42 عاما. بداية الثورة كانت ناجحة وكان
In the
الأمل
beginning,
كبيرا
the revolution was very
بأن
successful.
تغير ليبيا من نظام شمولي واستبدادي
But after
إلى
that
نظام يعتمد
was the new
بالدستور
changes
والقوانين
and the greed of certain number of people.
ويرعى
We
حقوق
went into
الإنسان
chaos.
التي هضمت طيلة هذه الفترة.
42 years is not easily wiped
لأن
from
قذافي
our
لم يترك مؤسسات
identity
لا
and
مؤسسة
from our
جيش
memories.
ولا أمن ولا مؤسسات للدولة كلها، ولذلك أصبحت الفوضى هي العامل المميز في هذه الفترة. ميليشيات تقتل وتنهب وتسجن، تنتهك حقوق الإنسان. في الأول كنا
In the past,
كان
we knew our
واحدة
oppressor. We knew where are the jails he set up everywhere in the country. But now,
ونعرف
we don't know whom are we
أين
fighting.
ذهب وماذا حل به. الآن لا
And the
تستطيع
rights
أن
of the
تعرف
sons of Libya,
المعتقل
the
أين هو
martyrs,
وماذا
seem to be
عانى
have gone
وكيف
in vain.
يعاني. يعني القتل والنهب والسلب هي الصفة المميزة الآن. وحقوق ليبيا وحقوق أبناء ليبيا الذين قاتلوا من أجل أن ينعموا بالحرية ذهبت أدراج الرياح. ليبيا بموقعها الجغرافي
Libya, with its geographical and economical nature, is very close to Europe.
بالنسبة
And any
لأوروبا
problem in Libya
هي
will
قريبة
eventually
جداً منها
affect Europe
وقريبة من الدول
and the
العربية
entire world
والأفريقية.
along.
وما يحدث فيها ستكون له انعكاسات على هؤلاء الجيران. نعم، إنهم وقفوا معنا في بدايتها.
Our neighbors stood by us
ولكن
in the
تركونا
beginning,
وشأننا.
but unfortunately they seem now to have given us
تركونا
up in a country
في
full of
دولة
problems and
مدججة
weapons.
بالسلاح أو في منطقة
These weapons became
مدججة
available for
بالسلاح.
other groups in our neighboring
وانتشر هذا
countries.
السلاح إلى
And nobody
جيراننا
likes that.
وأصبحت ليبيا ملاذا لكل مخرب أو كل طامع.
We hope that
في
our
مهد
neighbors will
خيراتها
realize that
وثرواتها
if there is
واستبدادها.
any fire in Libya, the heat will eventually reach you
نعم.
too. We hope that the
جيراننا
international community will
أن
help us,
يفكروا مليا
will help the loyal
ويعرفوا
sons of Libya
أن
to
اللهب
stop the killing and
لابد أن
build their
يصيبهم.
own country on the common values we all share,
يجب أن
values
يضعوا
of
أيديهم
peace and stability.
مع المخلصين من أبناء ليبيا لوضع حلول تكفل للليبيين حريتهم وآدميتهم بين الشعوب. لا أقول تدخلا عسكريا، ولكن
I am not
هناك
calling
وسائل
for a
أخرى
military intervention.
للضغط
I am calling for finding other ways to
على
help our country. And that will not happen by supporting those who call themselves leaders, those whom we know that they represent only the Gaddafi regime, with one government after another, with nothing on their agendas but stealing the wealth of our nation. We went through the election experience, but on the 7th of July 2014, they made their own one-sided election of the National Conference. We disagreed with this move because it was not built on correct basis. And unfortunately, the United Nations, the international community, and the United States of America blessed this illegal election. After this, there came the Parliament election, which is currently operating from Tobruk in the east, which was a very successful election and everybody participated in it, including those who are now against it. They didn't like that they lost the majority they managed in the National Conference election. So they took what they called justice with their own hands and against everyone. And so the coup took place, and a parallel government and parliament were established in Tripoli.
ثم بعد ذلك كانت تجربة انتخاب البرلمان الليبي الحالي الموجود في طبرق. كانت انتخابات أفضل من سابقتها وشارك فيها الجميع، ولكن هناك فئة ساءها أنها لم تحصل على النجاح الذي كان عندها في المؤتمر الوطني، وهي قلة لا تزيد عن 20 ممثلا، فدبرت انقلابا في طرابلس وحكومة موازية وبرلمانا موازيا. لماذا؟ لإرضاء رغبتهم في أن يكونوا هم المهيمنين وهم أصحاب السلطة. وبذلك أصبحت ليبيا مقسمة إلى اثنين: برلمان منتخب معترف به العالم، ومؤتمر وطني ميت يراد أن يبعث إلى الحياة من جديد. فنحن أتكلم عن التيار الفيدرالي.
If you ask me what is the best way to go out of this mess, I would answer with one answer and one answer only: a federal system. In Barqa, we called of reactivating of the 1951 constitution, which was not removed by Gaddafi or reactivated by any new government. This is a great constitution which respects human rights and keeps the dignity of the Libyan people.
نفعله بعد الثورة وهو يضمن حقوق الجميع.
They refused our initiative, accusing us of attempting to divide Libya when we are actually trying to unify it. Now they are the ones dividing Libya, not us. And that's why we are now calling the nation to reactivate the 1951 constitution and set a federal system based on the three main states: Tripoli, Barqa, and Fazan. Even Gaddafi sort of kept the state system, calling each state a Sha'biyya, or a people's province. I do believe that if we agreed on the federal system, it will save us and spare us a lot of trouble. We are suffering because of the lack of the state presence. We only have a fake state, a name without an actual presence. This fake state is created, or a parallel state is created based on law number 7, which authorized a certain militia to attack Bin Walid city and other parts of Libya. Revenge is not going to give us any reconciliation, or it will never take us anywhere. We are not going to manage to build Libya, but on fairness, justice, peace, and respecting human rights, not attacking each other and killing each other. We all need to compromise, sit down together, and find a way to live together.
أن وضع ليبيا الحالي هو وضع لا يسر كما قلت من الفوضى العارمة.
Our condition is not pleasant at all, and the international community is watching. We thank the United Nations for its efforts to put us all back together, but I do believe that these efforts were not built on correct basis, because the United Nations is trying to help MPs who are in the favor of the Parliament and other MPs who are against it.
بن وليد وغيرها وحدث مآسي في هذه الحركة هو إحياء لثارات قديمة ونحن لا نريد
As if the entire country is going to be fine just because two groups agreed on peace. But what about the other groups, militias, tribes? The situation is way more complicated than being built on the peace of two groups. There are other groups and other tribes. The Amazighis, the Tawarik, and other major tribes, they were not heard in the constitution that they are trying to do. They mentioned the new constitution and talked about the committee of the 60 experts. This is wrong because the committee did not include everyone, and we all know that the Derna MPs couldn't take part in this committee because of the security situation and traveling across the country. So that's why any decision taken by this committee will not serve Libya, because there will be always those who oppose its decisions. Human rights, we speak about it and we fight for it, but many were killed for those who dared to speak up and call for a one agreed on Libya. You will not find courts or police or prosecutors in Benghazi and many other cities. What do you expect from a country which lacks the presence of such important entities? We cannot call this a country or a state or even a government.
فلجنة الستين هي ليست لجنة 60 لأن النواب من منطقة درنا لم يستطيعوا أن يلتحقوا بها نتيجة الوضع الأمني السيء، والأمازيغ لم يلتحقوا بها، ولذلك أعتقد أن أي قرار تتخذه هذه اللجنة 60 هو لا يلبي المصلحة الوطنية بالنسبة لليبيا. حقوق الإنسان ندافع عنها ونتحدث عنها، ولكن قتل الكثيرون ممن جهروا برأيهم، لأن الميليشيات لا تريد أن يرتفع صوت ينادي بالعدل والعدالة. بنغازي ليس فيها محاكم وليس فيها شرطة وليس فيها نيابة، وكذلك بعض المدن، والقضاء معدوم، ودولة بدون قضاء وبدون دستور لا يمكن أن نسميها دولة. لذلك
In Barqa, we all work to the best of our ability for the reactivation of the 1951 constitution.
بقدر الإمكان
We are not calling for a monarchy, but for building a country after a real referendum. This constitution was put with the help of the United Nations and must be reactivated for the good of our country. Good intentions are what we need to get Libya out of this mess. A very expected period after an uprising, but it's the time to move on and build up, not destroy.
عندنا دستور شاركت في وضعه الأمم المتحدة ودستور تعترف به ولا بد أن يفعل. إذا وجدت النية الصادقة لإخراج البلاد من هذه الدوامة. الفساد مستسرم والأموال تهدر، لا صحة لا تعليم لا بنية تحتية.
There is no infrastructure or health or education or anything in Libya. We need to move on and fast. I call our brothers and neighbors in Malta to help us. You are an honest country without any hidden agendas for Libya. We call you to help us by being our voice in the international community. The neighbor knows better, and you know our problems more than anyone else.
وكانت النتيجة كما ترونها الآن. أدعو إلى مشاركة إخواننا في مالطا. مالطا دولة صديقة ودولة جارة وليست لها أطماع، أن تكون من ضمن مفوضية الأمم المتحدة أو يكون حتى رئيسها.
We trust you and your intentions as well, because you are closer to our hearts than anyone else. And from here, I call for the formation of a real national army in my country, an army which protects, not kills, helps, not terrifies, which has nothing to do with politics. And from here I tell my people, please do not do the same mistake we did before, worshipping a person and calling him the one and only. We are a great nation and we surely deserve better than creating a half-god, half-leader kind of ruler. Gaddafi was not fair to our army, and now our army is fighting with the fighting militias. I pray them not to follow Gaddafi's footsteps, dealing with the problem, because in the end, we are all Libyans. And the same thing goes on the other security bodies. I have a concrete faith that we will go out of this and that we will all prevail. We will eventually become a respected nation, a nation with an international role and presence, a nation recognized by all the international community, a nation that respects its duties and its commitments, a nation that everybody respects. Before Gaddafi, any Libyan citizen was welcome anywhere in the world, but now we became the ticking bomb. This is not how we want to represent ourselves to the world. We are much greater than this.
بحجة أنه جيش ليبي، ولكن أرجو من هذا الجيش ألا ينهج نفس النهج أو الخطأ الذي ارتكبه القذافي ونعيد الكرة من جديد. وكذلك قوات الأمن التي يجب أن تكون حامية للشعب لا صوتا يلهب ظهره. ومع الأسف الأخطاء تستمر، ولكن الأمل دائما موجود.
There is always hope, and I know we will build our country. I know we will prevail. I know we will overcome the difficulty and the hardship that we are facing at the moment. Danger is continuous, but our will and our determination is continuous as well.
كالقنبلة الموقوتة يخشاه الجميع، مع أن الشعب الليبي شعب طيب ويحب الجميع، ولكن الانتهازيين هم الذين وصلوا إلى هذه الدرجة. تحياتي.
I greet you all, and I hope I didn't take much of your precious time. I just got carried away opening my heart in a friend-to-a-friend talk. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and I hope to see you once again.
وأشكركم على حسن الاستماع.
After the Lockerbie agreement with Libya, there was a whitewash of sorts, and many people in the West got a blurred view of what the Gaddafi regime really meant. There seemed to be a collective amnesia. So when Gaddafi toppled, the full extent of what the Gaddafi regime meant for the Libyan people perhaps wasn't so clear for everyone. And now that there is chaos again in Libya, as you described it, we've seen a situation where people are going back to his words, the words of Gaddafi when the revolt first broke out. His warning that if he left, there would be civil war in Libya, that Libya wouldn't manage to govern itself, that Libya wouldn't manage to keep the forces, the factions from fighting each other. For someone who paid the price of the human rights abuses during the regime, how do you answer to that question, to someone who says Libya was better off under Gaddafi?
Gaddafi's words means one thing and one thing only, that he was only thinking of himself. We heard the same words from Mubarak and from Zain al-Abidin. It's the usual words of dictators. What happened in Libya after the uprising was planned. A country without any infrastructure, without a real administration, real security, and with corruption everywhere. Chaos is a logic thing to happen. Freedom has a price, a very high one indeed, and we paid it. I am sure that we will eventually reach our shores of safety, no matter how hard the road will be. A constitutional state with all citizens equal in rights and duties, and with a law system which allows human rights to be respected and protected.
لها ثمن وثمن باهظ وقد دفعناه ولا بد أن نصل إلى النتيجة التي نريدها مهما كانت الصعوبات وهي دولة دستورية يتساوى فيها الجميع دون تفريق أو تمييز للون أو دين أو عرق ودون انتقام من أحد إلا جزاء بما قدمه من اعتداءات أو شيء يدينه القضاء وليس أخذ الحق باليد لأنها تصبح فوضى بعد.
I was fortunate enough to be in Benghazi when the revolution was going on. The toppling of Gaddafi was quite far away, and the front line was moving to and fro. So the situation was quite critical at that point. But I remember it was a huge experience for me because there was this sense of community, and I've been in Libya several times before the revolution. There was a sense of community that I didn't feel any time before. And there was a huge sense of hope. The biggest risk we faced, in reality, wasn't coming from the war itself, but it was from celebration fire, whenever we told a group of rebels that we came from Malta. Today, when one looks at Libya, it's very hard to have that hope. Yet you speak with a tone of hope. What gives you confidence that Libya can overcome this present crisis?
My confidence comes from the faith I have in the sons of Libya, those who lived in Libya and suffered under the Gaddafi's regime, and those who lived in exile. At the moment, we can say that nothing changed in Libya, but the name, the flag, and the national anthem. Ex-regime people are still trying to climb our shoulders to reach power, but we are here and still fighting for our freedom and our prosperity. As you said in the beginning, we were one. But after the liberation of Tripoli and after the safes were opened, greed sneaked in and chaos started to take place. Now, all what we want to see is to find us back on the revolutionary road and to find the people of Libya choosing for themselves what do they want. If they want a republic, if they want a monarchy, if they want even a jamahiriya, we don't mind, but we want them to choose freely.
دون الاعتماد على المتسلقين الذين أفسدوا هذه الثورة التي كانت كما ذكرها سيادة الصحفي الآن الموجود عندي يقول في بداية الثورة كان في تآلف. نعم كانت في تآلف وفي روح جماعية وفي بذل من أجل وحدة ليبيا كاملة، لكن مع الأسف بعد تحرير طرابلس وانفتاح الخزائن انقلبت الأمور رأسا على عقب وأصبح همهم الوحيد هو نهب هذه الثروة والسيطرة وفرض السلطة بالقوة.
I would like to open up the floor to questions. As I said before, I would invite you to be brief in your questions.
My name is Ian Camilleri. I had the pleasure to meet Mr. Senussi last night, and I was very much enlightened and with good spirit that has come to me, showing great signs of hope for the future, notwithstanding what's going on in Libya at the moment. The question I have for you, Mr. Senussi, is this. Are you prepared to compromise with your opponents at the moment to accept a form of transitional council, which was after all already in place during the revolution, where every stakeholder, every body involved can be involved in this council, to form at least a phase where the international community can communicate with and start a process of doing things that will start the process of stopping this fighting. One we talked about yesterday was an embargo of arms, stopping the profiteers from making money selling arms to Libya, and have no real intention of seeing this conflict ending. That's one. You mentioned the referendum. Start talking about the referendum. Start talking about the organizational structures where other countries can help, including Malta. Are you prepared to compromise with such a council?
In fact, if the gentleman goes back to my speech in the European Parliament in 2011, when I won the prize, I spoke about a nationwide conciliation with everyone, without excluding anyone, even those who were on Gaddafi's side, till the last minute. Libya will not be built but on conciliation, seriousness, tolerance, and good intentions. We want to build our country on the common values everybody shares, on security and for everyone. We want to build our country freed and respected by everyone. Youth is the greatest pillar of our nation, and I pray our youth to wake up and to go back to the good nature of Libyan people.
لأن نمد أيدينا ونتناسى ما ننسى ولكن لا نتناسى ما حدث في الماضي ونتطلع إلى مستقبل أفضل يحفظ أرواح شبابنا التي تزهق في حروب أو في قتال ليس لنا فيه ناقة ولا جمل أو كما يقول المثل عندنا العربي، والمستهدف هو هؤلاء الشباب المغرر بهم، لأن الشباب هو عماد أي دولة تريد أن تنهض وتبني مستقبلها من جديد. وأنا أهيب بشبابنا ألا يتبعوا من يدعو إلى حمل السلاح ونبذ الكفاح بمواصلة الحوار الجاد للوصول إلى هدفنا ألا هو الدولة الليبية.
My name is Joseph Khassar. I'm a former ambassador of Malta to Libya. In the past weeks, we have had a very interesting development. I mean, in the sense that the international community recognizes the Legislative Assembly. On the other hand, we have had the Supreme Court in Libya declaring the elections as invalid. How do you see the way forward at this point, in the sense that the international community, notwithstanding the sentence of the Supreme Court, still continues to give recognition to the former government, which is now operating from the east part of Libya?
The next step would be respecting the fact that the elected Libyan parliament is the only legitimate representative of the Libyan people. A court sentence is not going to change that. They accepted to take part in these elections, and when the result did not come to their wishes, they did their coup. That means one thing: for these people, Libya doesn't come first.
من حقه في أن يكون هو الممثل الوحيد لهذا الشعب باعتراف الدول، بغض النظر عن حكم محكمة قد يكون تحت الإكراه. لكن على الذين يناوئون هذا المجلس بحجج واهية عليهم أن يراجعوا أنفسهم وأن يقدموا مصلحة ليبيا على مصلحتهم الخاصة. هم قبلوا بالانتخابات وشاركوا في هذه الانتخابات، وعندما ظهرت النتائج بغير ما يرضيهم حدث انقلاب من ميليشياتهم وأسسوا حكومة هذا العمل يدل على أن ليبيا لا تأتي في المقدمة بالنسبة لهم، وإنما هي يعني وسيلة للوصول إلى غايتهم ألا وهي الحكم فقط.
And I would just like to add something to that. In recent weeks, we've had a delegation from the Libyan government, the Haftar government, I mean. And there was the UN representative in Malta. And there seemed, although it wasn't very clear from their public statements, but people in the know were saying that there was a real extended hand. There was a real opportunity for discussions to begin on a proper reconciliation. It probably comes from the fact that both sides now are not in the strongest of positions. The Parliament is holed up in Tobruk, doesn't have control over a large part of the country, not even Tripoli. On the other side, the Tripoli Parliament and government doesn't have access to certain oil fields and certain infrastructure. What happened to that process? Had it started? Was it going anywhere?
I believe that this is not a reconciliation. This is making peace between two groups of MPs. A nationwide conciliation is what we need. What's happening now is a political maneuver, nothing more or less.
بأطراف أخرى مغيبة، القبائل، الفيدراليون، الأمازيغ، التبو، الطوارق، ويوضع لها أساس وشروط بحيث نضمن نجاحها في المستقبل. أما هذا العمل الذي يحدث الآن فهو عبارة عن زوبعة سياسية أو زوبعة إعلامية لا أكثر ولا أقل.
I think we are of the same age. In my younger days, I used to work in the Mustashfa Muwassat and at King Idris. And there was peace there and a lot of good business taking place and little problems existed. I see in you a new Nelson Mandela that can do a lot of good, same as the old man did in South Africa. I augur that you will continue doing this good job, and I feel safe that given good constitution, but it must be the constitution not based on the regal system. The 1951 was based on King Idris. I hope that a constitution that will consider Parliament as supreme will enjoy more and supreme future for everybody. Thank you.
The constitution issue is to be left for the Libyan people to decide. But first, there must be a certain agreement on the values on which we can build a new constitution. If you notice, the last parliament was divided according to a federal system, but without having any accurate information on numbers, which is not reliable at all. 100 seats for Tripoli, 40 for Fazan, 60 for Barca, without real studies, without nothing. It's all built on assumptions.
تكوين أعضاء البرلمان أو المؤتمر الوطني كان مقسما على أساس فيدرالي. طرابلس 100 عضو واحد، بالنسبة لبرقة 60 عضو، بالنسبة لفزان 40. وهذا التقسيم قسم اعتباطا. نعم هي فيدرالية، لكن الذي قام بالتقسيم لم يعمل دراسة حقيقية لكي يقرر أي ولاية لها هذا العدد أو ذاك العدد أو غيره.
We spoke about a federal system. So if you already built the parliament and the national conference on a federal system, so a federal system is what we need to have in Libya. They said we were calling for dividing Libya, and now they are the ones dividing it. We want people to choose for themselves a republic, a monarchy, or even a jamahiriya, as I said, as long as they choose freely.
وأنه بداية الانفصال وما إلى ذلك، وشنوا علينا حملة قوية من جميع الصحف والإذاعات والمتحدثين، ولكن مع الأسف دارت الأيام فإذا بهم هم الذين يريدون أن يقسموا ليبيا وقد قسموا فعلا. نعم، نترك قضية الدستور للشعب الليبي. هل يريد العودة؟ يريد التنقيح؟ يريد الملكية؟ يريد الجمهورية؟ حتى الجماهيرية ما عندناش مانع، لكن بدون إكراه. هذا اللي نؤمن به.
Part of the problem in coming to this sort of discussion is Libya's geography. Some of the communities that you are referring to are poles apart. Benghazi is 8-hour, 9-hour drive from Tripoli. The territory is just huge, and there are communities which are completely cut off from the centers of power. Can the European Union help perhaps organize some sort of convention which would bring about disparate communities and have them sit down at a table to discuss what you're talking about?
The EU can help if they adopt the right approach, talking to the right people. You cannot speak to Mahmoud Jibril alone or the Muslim Brothers only. Libya is way bigger than that. King Idris in 1949, after World War II, there was a group of people who fought with the Italians, and obviously most of the country was fighting against them. People were speaking about excluding certain people, but he made a meeting in Darna and asked everybody to forgive and forget. That was a historical action which was only followed by Nelson Mandela decades later. I pray those who are dragging the country down to reconsider their views and their intentions and spare us the mess. This is my opinion and also my hope.
الحرب العالمية الثانية كان الوضع مشابها. كان هناك أشخاص تعاونوا مع الإيطاليين وأشخاص قاتلوا مع المجاهدين والوطنيين، ولما وضعت الحرب العالمية أوزارها كنا نسمع لغط إقصاء فلان وإقصاء علان، وكان هذا مع الطليان وهذا مع، فوضع صلح في درنا في 46 ما بين القبائل الليبية البرقوية حقيقة، أمرهم فيها بتناسي الماضي وبناء ليبيا أو بناء برقة. في ذلك الوقت كانت إمارة، بناء برقة من جديد والتنازل عن كل المطالب التي تنادي بالانتقام. وبهذا الصلح يسمى صلح الحرابي في درنا.
The EU can help if they adopt the right approach, talking to the right people. You cannot speak to Mahmoud Jibril alone or the Muslim Brothers only. Libya is way bigger than that. King Idris in 1949, after World War II, there was a group of people who fought with the Italians, and obviously most of the country was fighting against them. People were speaking about excluding certain people, but he made a meeting in Darna and asked everybody to forgive and forget. That was a historical action which was only followed by Nelson Mandela decades later. I pray those who are dragging the country down to reconsider their views and their intentions and spare us the mess. This is my opinion and also my hope.
لا فائدة منها. هذا هو رأيي وهذا هو أملي في المستقبل إن شاء الله.
Mr. El-Senussi, in your speech you mentioned how important Malta's ties to Libya are. How do you think that Malta can contribute further to help Libya establish fully functioning democratic institutions? Thank you.
My question is, very often in the Western press, the situation in Libya now is portrayed as one between secularists and Islamic extremists. What is Mr. Senussi's reading on this?
Malta has a great and special place in our hearts, and as I mentioned before, you could help us by being our voice in the international community. Maybe a Maltese delegation can play the middleman between those who are fighting together in Libya, and we strongly suggest the United Nations to depend on Malta when they send any delegations to Libya, because they know us better. They are our neighbors and our friends.
وينقل وجهات النظر بأمانة من هذا الطرف إلى ذاك الطرف ويقرب بينهم لأن لا أحد يعرف أمورنا مثل الجار القريب الذي ليس له مطمع في شيء ومالطا هي هذا الجار فنرجو حتى من الأمم المتحدة أن تعتمد على أبناء مالطا في بعثاتها التي تكون عندنا في ليبيا. السؤال الثاني الصراع ما بين العلمانيين.
As for the second question, a conflict between secularists and Islamists, yes, we have different directions, but not as deep as you think. Islamists do exist in Libya, but they don't have a great base. We are all moderate Muslims in Libya, and there is no place for such directions. We denounce violence, and I do have hope that the future holds a lot of good things for us.
أقليم أو آخر لكن هذا الإقليم أنا اللي أعيش فيه ليس له حاضنة في هذه البلاد بدليل أن الانتخابات عندنا لم يحصل على شيء ولذلك هذه أوهام قضية علماني وإسلامي مجموعات بسيطة لكن لا نطلقها على جميع أبناء الشعب الليبي أنهم مقسمين بين إسلاميين وبين علمانيين. احنا إسلامنا وسط وندعو إلى التعاون ندعو إلى التآزر ننبذ العنف هذا طبعا ولذلك أنا عندي أمل كبير في المستقبل أن ليبيا سيكون لها دور مفيد إن شاء الله.
Does it also come from the fact that many people really don't understand Libya? That there's a very poor understanding of the Libyan makeup, of the makeup of Libyan society and
Mainstream media is always after big hits. I don't say all media is like that, but many do portray the conflict from their own point of view, not as it really is. Here I remind our Libyan extremists of the Quran verse which says, "Call for the way of your God with wisdom and good advice, and argue with them in good manners. You will find those who were your enemies to be your sincere friends." This is our Quran, and this is what our Prophet also said, encouraging us to do the same.
بما أمر الله به سبحانه وتعالى وأنا أريد أن أوجه كلمتي إلى إخواننا الإسلاميين أن أقول لو تمسكتم بقوله تعالى ادعو إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. هذا هو القرآن الذي يأمرنا بأن نتبع هذا السبيل. ثم أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول ما دخل العنف شيئا إلا شانه وما دخل السلم والحلم شيئا إلا زانه. يعني يدعو إلى نبذ العنف يشين أي أمر تخش فيه العنف لابد أن يشينه.
Thank you, Mr. El-Senussi, for giving this talk. I'm a student of European Studies. My question concerns the overarching institutions which would be common to the federalist solution that you're speaking about, namely, for instance, the Supreme Court. How do you perceive trust being built in such institutions by the Libyan community as a whole, should the solution actually be implemented? Thank you.
The federal system is desired in Libya at the moment. It is not strange to us. We had it from 1951 to 1963, and everything was functioning perfectly. But after the coup and changing everything to be in one man's hand, the sufferance started. We are not less than Emirates, which has a federal system. And now everybody wants to visit it and enjoy its stability. Malaysia as well as some advanced countries as well. They have the same system. They are all functioning very well. We hope for a brighter future. And I do have a great faith in our people and in our will. We will be there, I'm telling you.
وصلت إلى مستوى مرموق ومحترم في العالم إلى ماليزيا هذه دول في مستوانا نحن فما بالك بالدول الأوروبية أو الأمريكية المتقدمة التي كان نظامها أو لا زال نظامها هو نظاما فيدراليا ويتمتع بخيره الجميع. نحن نأمل في المستقبل ولا نريد أن يفت في عضدنا أو يحد من أملنا. هل ستكون هناك مؤسسات ما تكون هناك؟ لا، هذه تعتمد على رغبة الأمة الليبية في بناء مؤسساتها وهي رغبة صادقة ولكن الظروف الحالية هي صعبة شوية وبعد هذه إن شاء الله تكون.
You speak a lot about hearing people's voices. You spoke about having a referendum to discuss which system would be best to adopt. In this current climate, how imminent or how likely is the possibility of a referendum? Thank you.
We asked for a referendum, but to have that, you have to be prepared with common values, common agreements, and common understanding. We now have many people who are not Libyans and were given the citizenship after they were brought to Libya to fight on Gaddafi's side. So we have to be careful who has the right to vote in a referendum. We have to know that a real Libyan is giving his voice, not somebody who is giving the citizenship just because he was actually fighting against us.
You mentioned in your speech that you made an appeal to the international community, and many people feel that Libya has been let down by the international community. There was a huge involvement by European states and other states, including the United States, during the revolution. But then everyone kind of pulled out and forgot about Libya. And a large part of what happened because, as you said, Libya didn't have institutions left by Gaddafi and was left to struggle with problems which are relatively normal for a post-revolution sort of scenario. What would your urgent appeal, particularly to the European Union? The European Parliament has addressed the Libyan situation very often, not so much other institutions in the European Union. What would your appeal to the European Union be?
First, I would like to say that we hold great respect for these institutions, for their support in the beginning of the revolution, but I also do blame them for leaving us in the middle of the road. We need support to build our institutions. We cannot build that on our own. When we gained our independence, the United Nations helped us. And the role they played was objective and essential. We need the same now.
نحن في بداية استقلالنا كان مستر أدريان بيلت هو مندوب الأمم المتحدة وقام بجهد كبير مشكور في تأسيس مؤسسات الدولة الليبية الحديثة ونكن له نحن كليبيين التقدير والاحترام إلى الآن لأنه كان محايدا ولم يكن يميل إلى هذا أو ذاك وكان واقعيا. فنريد أشخاصا مثل هؤلاء مثل مستر أدريان بيلت ليساعدونا في بناء مؤسساتنا وفي بناء دولتنا الحديثة بدون أن يكون هناك التدخل العسكري الذي يمقته كل إنسان.
I'll have Mr. Ramadan Ben Al-Haj, political advisor for the General National Committee of Libya.
Good morning. My name is Ramadan Belhaj and I am politically active in Libya, and especially in Tripoli, because I live in Tripoli. I am a member of the Libyan Center for Strategical Studies and member in the Libyan Institute for the Political Studies as well. I would like to thank you for this opportunity that you invited me to come here and contribute with some description of the situation in Libya. Special thanks for Mr. Ahmed El Senussi for his contribution and for his description about the situation in Libya. As we know, the situation in Libya in general, the country struggling of two governments, two parliaments, and there are two front lines that are still open, and in those front lines, people dying every day, and the blood running every day, and all the people who are dying in those front lines are Libyan, and most of them young people. The front lines are one in Benghazi, the other one in the western mountains, which is especially in Kikla. Kikla, it's a small village or small city, and all the people there, the population of this village, been deported the last few weeks. I think the situation in Benghazi, most of you maybe know about it. There are bombing there by the airplanes. There are battles going on every day. There are about 600 families who are refugees from Benghazi, and they are in Tripoli now. There are about 4,000 families from Benghazi living now as a refugee in Misrata, and of course there are other families in other areas around. The situation in Tripoli or in the western area, because Libya now practically it's divided to two areas. The eastern area where the Parliament in Tobruk and the government of Mr. Itni, and then the western area where the National Assembly, which is the GNC, and the government of Mr. Al-Hasi controlling Tripoli and the western area. The situation in Tripoli is a bit better. The city is safe. The school is open. The university is open. There are no crises. But there are the front line in on the mountains, as I told you, and it's still open and still a war there. As a politically active, I've been talking to lots of international organizations that work with the humanitarian issues, and we try to help those organizations to get into the front lines areas in the western area and even in Benghazi as well. We try to find some way to get them to Benghazi to help the injured people and the families who are in a big need of help. I think the battle or the crisis in Libya, it's not because of ideologies. I think it's political crisis. And I think it's between the people who still belong to the old regime, Gaddafi regime, and the people who came with the revolution of 17th of February. As Libya, as part of the international community and as a part of the Mediterranean we are against the terrorism, we are against the extremism, and in our mentality, we believe that the extremism has no place in Libya. Maybe we have some small, very small groups, but the biggest part of Libyan and the Libyan community, they have the Mediterranean mentality, and we are against all those extremisms and the terrorism. We, as a Libyan, we feel that we have been let down by the international community after the revolution. You know, Gaddafi's regime didn't build any authorities or institutes. So, and we need lots of help by the international community, by the European community to build up all those institutes and authorities so we can progress and we can then build up the state. As we know, Mr. Bernardino has lots of attempts to bring all parts on one table. He had an attempt to start the dialogue. I think it was last Tuesday. It was 9th of December, but this meeting was postponed till next week, and we hope this dialogue or this meeting at least, which is preparation for the dialogue, will take place next week. I've been talking to some people or some politicians who are invited to this dialogue, and we are supporting this step, and it's very important for Libya and for the Libyan, and we hope even for a big support from the European community and from UN as well. There is a decision from the High Court, and we hope this decision will be respected and accepted by the international community, because it's that this decision and even the dialogue are very important parts to start towards a solution in Libya. So, and as I said, and I will repeat it again, the help of the international community is very important for Libya, especially this time, because we still have two front lines going on, lots of refugees inside the country, and people dying every day. And I hope the international community will take these problems seriously and contribute and give very good contribution to help the Libyan. Thank you very much.
I would like to welcome Dr. Alfred Sand, head of the Socialist and Democrat delegation from Malta and former Prime Minister.
Mr. El-Senussi, friends, I would just like to take a step back from the overall details of what's been happening in Libya to turn them into a reflection about the values and interests which illuminate how developments proceed. But could I start by also extending my greetings to Mr. Senussi, thank him for being with us this morning, and confirm how much we appreciate his views about the values and events which are shaping today the future of North Africa, the Mediterranean, indeed Europe. His views and ideas have been shaped by a lifetime of suffering and sacrifice, which inevitably make them more precious and more powerful. At a time when some values have shifted and other values seem to have taken meanings that were never envisaged before our time, at a time when the events of today seem to be contradicting the lessons we just learned from the events of yesterday, the qualities assumed by the long-term values that people like Mr. Senussi express do have a broader and more meaningful impact. They cannot be ignored for they have been forged and acquired through experience. It has become almost natural for people who have been involved in the project of European integration, or of European unification, if you like, to assume that their values, or some of them, can and should have universal resonance and acceptance. European values, they believe, stand for rationality, freedom to live and choose, freedom to believe and express one's beliefs, freedom to trade, freedom to move, and so on. But most of all, they stand for human rights. The recognition that there are basic rights of the human person as an individual that should be respected in an absolute sense and under all possible circumstances. This is a time when, despite globalization, new crusades have been launched to create an alternative formulation of the values that should define our lives. Some revert to the traditional ways of understanding human society. They carry religious convictions and procedures to the point that they declare them unchangeable, and any body who disagrees with this must be put outside the pale, indeed exterminated. Other crusaders seem to aim at injecting a so-called postmodern consciousness on all and sundry. They fail to make allowance for the point that if political, economic, and social changes are to be assimilated properly, they need first to be comprehended by individuals and the communities where they live as relevant to their context, as crucially important elements, therefore, in safeguarding an acceptable future for their loved ones. Another problem with present-day crusades, whether they come from the radical traditional side or from the radical modernist wing, is that practically all, they assume their relevance to be universal. Now, for those who believe that the rights of the human being as an individual should be supreme, can this assumption be considered valid? The dilemmas that such observations pose, and they are relevant, very relevant to Libya in my view, cannot simply be swept aside. Chief of which is the point that no matter what we say to qualify cultural divergences, some red lines will be there when value differences are being mapped out, for instance, on the rights of women. Yet, values are defined in the framework of interests of the person, interests of the family, of the tribe, of the community, interests of the country, of the religion and its leaders, of business and their leaders, and so on. Within values are asserted beyond what the mass of the people can comprehend. And when values are asserted beyond that comprehension, we find that mobilization against the promoters of such values is going to proceed very, very fast. And we've seen this in Libya as well. When values are promoted by the use of outside force in order to overcome interests, they generate new resistances and the assertion of alternative values, which is what happened, unfortunately, to the Arab Spring. The values that the Spring asserted went beyond the values that too many people felt familiar with, while running against interests, popular, traditional, and elitist, that remained very powerful. Outside interference, some of it blatant, compounded the problem and has turned it into a crisis. Vide the situation in Egypt. On the European side, it is quite likely that the Arab Spring was seen mostly as a fast track towards the adoption of quote-unquote European values by Arab countries. That was an illusion, because quote-unquote European values, even the most fundamental one of human rights, cannot simply be exported. They can only be assimilated in a dialectical manner, subsumed and altered in the culture with which European values interact, and finally forged into a relatively homogeneous model, not least as a result of the ongoing pressures of globalization. Quite rightly, many Arabs now consider European reactions to the Arab Spring as partly hypocritical, because they were also defined not by the push of values, but by the tugs of interests. Freedom and new rights are very rarely attained through the intervention of foreign powers, overt or covert. They come from a courageous and potent declaration of values and rights being assumed by populations which seek redress from injustice and oppression, like we've just heard Mr. El-Senussi declare here in this chamber. That is the way by which the fundamental values of Europe were declared in the past. Even so, these declarations are not perfect and still need further development. I have no doubt that it is the method by which other peoples of our earth will continue to assert their rights and their choices. Violence and barbarities will remain part of the equation till reason and solidarity triumph, even if it will not be necessarily a European type of solidarity or a European type of reason. That triumph will arrive after lots of sacrifices by heroes, martyrs, and ordinary people. Mr. El-Senussi is a living witness of the ongoing process which will eventually promote the emergence of new generations of people committed to a scale of human rights which need not be Eurocentrically defined or determined. We thank him for bringing his message of experience and hope to us. Thank you very much.
That brings us to our conclusion. I'd like to thank all of you for being present. I'd like to thank all the speakers, but especially, obviously, Mr. Senussi. I personally, I hope the audience feels the same. I found your contribution very inspiring. I think you're a very valid voice in the debate currently taking place about Libya, if I may say so. I would like to thank the European representation for organizing this meeting. Let's hope there'll be others in the future. Thank you very much.